thank you so much for coming in to talk to us. So we're going to talk all things gut health today. Before we get into that, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm a registered nutritional therapist and health educator, originally from Southern California. Been a full-time practitioner for over 10 years now. I do have a few areas of clinical interest, gut health being one of them, cardiovascular health, anything to do with energy metabolism, and anything to do with winding or slowing down the hands of time with regards to aging is really interesting to me. I do some lecturing for the College of Naturopathic Medicine, and more recently I'm involved in a health tech startup called Nutritional. I'm their chief nutritionist, and we're on a path to try and make nutrition support a standard benefit for employees in the UK and the US.
Brilliant. So to kick things off, can you tell me, why is diet so important to our gut health?
2,500 years ago, Hippocrates, the so-called father of Western medicine, is famous for this classic line, all disease begins in the gut. He made that claim based on his clinical observations with his patients, and they would come to him with ailments that were obviously outside of the gut, but he found that when he treated their gut, these symptoms often improved, if not totally resolved. The term microbiome, which refers to that collective 100 trillion microbes that reside in our gut, that term didn't exist 25 years ago. And today it's probably the most prolific area of scientific study. We've discovered thousands of species and strains, and we have this vast repository of evidence now linking all manner of diseases to our gut. Type 2 diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, autoimmunity, mental health, of course, depression, anxiety, autism, and that's fueled growing public awareness of the gut as well. Although we've learned a huge amount, I think there's probably more that we don't know still than we do know about the gut.
We recently conducted research among over 800 men and women, looking into foods that triggered gut health issues. IBS, bloating, diarrhea, acid reflux, constipation, so forth. In that research, it was shown that refined bread, dairy, milk, in particular, were the biggest causes of gut health issues, and gluten, I should add. I think it was 25% of people plus were affected each day in their diet by these things, if they had them in their diet, and were essentially intolerant to them. Why are so many people intolerant to these types of foods?
It's what we call multifactorial. There's a number of things at play. One, I think it's evolution, right? We didn't evolve eating wheat and dairy, really. If you think back 150,000 generations of evolution, a couple of million years of hunting and gathering, we weren't eating grains. Harvesting wild grains took a lot of energy and just didn't pack the nutrition punch for the hassle that was involved of gathering them and drying them and soaking them and crushing them. It just didn't really happen. And dairy either wasn't really consumed. I mean, we drank our mother's breast milk and then we grew teeth, right? It would have been pretty hard to milk a wild animal. So it just didn't really happen. And so naturally, we haven't evolved the enzymes needed to properly digest wheat and dairy. Our immune system kind of considers these foreign objects. And so in a considerable percentage of the population, the immune system responds. You know, most of the immune system's in the gut, and it says, hey, what is this? And it creates inflammation. So that's one aspect. I also think we're losing our microbiome diversity. When you think about the role of our immune system is to protect us from non-self, okay? And we know that our immune system is educated by our microbiome, right? These 100 trillion organisms and their genetic material. Our immune system has to learn to tolerate these 100 trillion microbes that are not us. We know that with less diversity of species in our gut, we have less tolerance. When I do a stool test on a client, for example, when you see a broad, diverse microbiome of species, they have a more tolerant immune system because it has to learn to tolerate all these different organisms. When we lose that tolerance, not surprisingly, we see more food intolerance coming up. And plus, thirdly, our food is changing. With increased processing of food, today's wheat is harder to digest than than 8,000 years ago.
There's a lot of discussion about ultra-processed food. Is that a growing area of concern? Should people be as worried about ultra-processed food?
100%. Ultra-processed food is why the chronic disease epidemic is on the rise and why the NHS is struggling funding-wise. No question. When we process food, we lose essential nutrients, and usually we see additives and chemicals come in. We lose fiber, so we don't feed the gut, which is pivotal to health. Sadly, 50% of the British diet today is from this category of ultra-processed food. We end up in a situation where, as a nation, we're overfed, but we're undernourished, and that's a recipe for chronic disease. Modern medicine and pharmacology is not the answer. I heard this great line, I think it was Dr. Robert Lustig. He said, you can't drug your way out of a food problem. Yeah. Chronic disease is not necessarily druggable, but it is foodable.
Yeah. Overfed, undernourished is a great line. So one area I really want to understand, because there's so much talk about it, has been for many years, it's resurfaced recently, is sugar and then sweeteners. The impact sugar has on our gut, and why is sugar seen as bad for us?
Everyone kind of now knows that sugar is probably public enemy number one. Today, the average kid goes to school with 2 to 3 times that in his belly in a bowl of breakfast cereal, not to mention the energy drinks that have 8, 10, 12 plus teaspoons of sugar. It's their breakfast. If you think evolutionarily, there's no genetic precedence in our evolutionary past for putting that kind of glycemic load on our body. We, of course, know that sugar rots our teeth. It's the quickest way to gain body fat is sugar, right? Because sugar elevates insulin, and insulin stores fat, right? So a big driver of obesity, type 2 diabetes, which breaking the NHS at the moment, half the nation, diabetic or pre-diabetic, but it's also very inflammatory on the body and on the gut. There's a condition that we call dysbiosis, which is kind of the opposite of symbiosis. Symbiosis kind of means a harmony amongst organisms, and dysbiosis is where that gets disrupted. And sugar actually, it kind of favors the growth of unhealthy organisms in our gut and shifts that balance from good bacteria to bad bacteria. So we see overgrowths with a high sugar diet of organisms like E. coli and Candida albicans, which is a yeast, and these organisms thrive on sugar. And that can be problematic for health. Sugar also affects our immune health, our immune function, and we know 70% of our immune system sits in our gut. Because of the massive surface area, if you stretched out our gut, you've got more than 2 tennis courts of exposure. And so, thank goodness we have 70% of our immune system there, because the immune system has to kind of decide what to let in and what to keep out. We know that a high sugar diet actually lessens the effectiveness of white blood cells, plus it's addictive as hell. But I think maybe that one of the really bad things that we're learning more recently now of sugar is fructose. Table sugar is 50% fructose. We used to think fructose was the good guy because it didn't elevate blood sugar. But what fructose does do, it upregulates this process in the body that we call de novo lipogenesis, which basically just means the making of new fat in the body. And so when this process is overactivated, it puts fat in our liver. And so it creates fatty liver. That spills over into the pancreas. We get a fat pancreas. And that is a big driver in type 2 diabetes.
So in a world where generally sugar has come down in consumption, relatively speaking, because people are more aware that it's bad, albeit maybe it's going up because there's prevalence of ultra-processed foods and so forth. Sweeteners, on the other hand, are growing like crazy, both plant sweeteners such as stevia and artificial sweeteners. How do sweeteners differ from sugar, and what is the impact of sweeteners on our gut?
Everyone got the memo, sugar's bad, but the world has a sweet tooth. And we've been fixated on the calorie. And so Big Food's answer to that is, hey, if we can have something super sweet and 0 calorie, problem solved. Except for one problem, it's worse for public health. We know we don't lose weight on so-called diet drinks using artificial sweeteners. Doesn't happen. And there's some great research coming out of Israel at the moment that shows that artificial sweeteners alter the gut microbiome. You know, they literally upset that balance in the gut, and they also impair glucose tolerance. So, of course, the ultimate answer is to kick the sweet tooth.
So when you've got healthy meal replacements, lots of protein drinks, powdered drinks, green smoothies, green shakes, and so forth, which have got various ingredients in them. Sometimes they've got sweeteners, sometimes not got sweeteners. Sometimes might have an artificial synthetic sweetener, sometimes might have a natural sweetener. What's your view on the real growth of these powdered meal replacement drinks and protein powders?
Gosh, there's so many of them. And I think, as with anything, some are better than others. And most of them use natural sweeteners like stevia or monk fruit extract. Nowadays, most people are undernourished, you know, because we're relying on processed foods. Yeah. And we know when you process foods, you lose nutrients big time. Real food is always best. If you can blitz your own, that's going to be great. And whole food is better than blitzed food. When you put something through a super high-speed blender, you are desiccating that fiber, and it's going to have a higher impact on your blood sugar. So it's not as good as eating fruit's better than drinking it. But a lot of these drinks contain prebiotic substances, inulin powder, probiotics as well. So looks like they are focusing on gut in their blend.
We've seen recently, particularly in the last sort of 2 years, a real growth in the popularity and demand for blood glucose monitors, and that is obviously one way of assessing your diet, your own personal reaction to certain foods, how your blood sugar responds. Can you just explain to us what the intended role of blood glucose monitors is, and how beneficial has the growth or increase in demand for them been amongst people who wouldn't typically be using blood glucose monitors, but now are, to assess their blood sugar?
Well, we used to monitor our blood glucose, and we still do, by a little finger prick test, where you can just prick your finger and put it on a little slip and stick it into the monitor, and boom, there's your blood glucose. But you're pricking your finger often and what have you, and it's painful. But the continuous glucose monitor is where you literally stick a little pin in your arm and it just sticks there. And with an app on your phone, you just tap it and you can just get a constant reading. So I think it's a brilliant advancement medically for diabetes management. They have clinical relevance for people that are, say, metabolically challenged, you know, metabolic syndrome, obesity. They're trying to get an understanding of what's happening in their blood when they eat. They're probably overkill for your average consumer. There's a novelty with them, and I think with that comes a honeymoon period, right? You can get some very useful information, but after a while, I mean, you know, a few weeks worth of that, and you're like, really? You know, every single meal? So I think the honeymoon wears off quick, and I think a simple finger prick blood glucose monitor is absolutely more than enough for an average person who wants to see what a few different meals does to their blood. It's much less invasive. I also think that these continuous glucose monitors can be potentially dangerous for anyone who maybe has a history of eating disorders or are at risk of kind of obsessive behaviors. Anytime we're tracking things, if it's like our steps and just constant every meal, that's probably not a good thing.
We're passionate about women's health, passionate about gut health, passionate about all things health. We recently conducted a study of over 1,500 women. As far as we're aware, is the first and largest of its kind into the impact of menopause on gut health. And it's well known amongst people like yourself that hormones affect our gut health, and vice versa. Over 90% of women, their gut health was affected during menopause, with women twice as likely to experience changes in their gut health during the perimenopause phase versus menopause. Bloating, constipation, acid reflux, IBS were all very common symptoms during menopause. Can you explain to us why does gut health change during menopause, and that connection between the hormones, female hormones, during menopause and gut health?
Sure. I mean, our microbiota, or microbiome, is influenced by everything we do, right? Of course, the foods we eat, how we move, how we sleep, even how we think. We know that chronic stress, for example, the hormones that we make during chronic stress change the shape of our microbiome, and we see declines in the population of bifidobacteria, for example, right? And so hormones affect our microbiota, right? We are their hosts, and they are sensitive to what we do, and it influences them. And turns out estrogen also affects the ecology of our microbiome, right? We think of estrogen as this reproductive hormone only, but there are receptors for estrogen all over the body. We find receptors for estrogen in our bones and our skin and our liver and brain, our cardiovascular system. And it turns out estrogen literally influences the genetic expression of the cells in our gut lining, okay? And that affects the environment that our microbiota kind of live in. And so we know that estrogen promotes the growth of beneficial bacteria like bifidobacteria, lactobacillus. These are the most abundant kind of commensal organisms that promote health, help protect our gut lining. They aid digestion. They protect us against pathogens in the gut. And so during menopause, of course, we see sharp declines in estrogen. And with that, we see declines in these beneficial bacteria, these species. And so naturally, we see an effect in our gut health. We see changes in bowel habits, as you mentioned, changes in motility. Constipation can rear its head, and that can lead to the overgrowth of wrong types of bacteria that can cause gut inflammation, and that can lead to symptoms, and it can lower our gut immunity that kind of leaves us more exposed. I say us, I mean the female population.
Once the estrogen levels have declined and then found their new equilibrium, does the gut microbiome then find a new way of dealing with or a new balance, which would then be expected that the gut health symptoms might then go away?
Yeah, I mean, you would like to think so. I mean, it's very individualized, of course. There's no two microbiomes that are the same, just so attached to the microbiome. And I think the difference between women that really suffer and women that don't suffer very much has to do with the shape of their gut. And I think you have to put more effort in during that time if you want to kind of lower the symptoms.
In our research, we asked women about the 1,500 participants, what were the changes in diet? 80% of women had tried to make changes in their diet to relieve symptoms of their gut health changes. 2/3 found those changes to be effective. And the most effective changes were increasing plants and vegetables, increasing fiber, reducing or avoiding alcohol, reducing or avoiding caffeine, and reducing or avoiding dairy. You've explained the fiber point, but what is it with alcohol and menopause, and what is it with caffeine and menopause and hormones that really create an issue?
I think, these are kind of toxins, right? So they put a load on the liver. The liver is on overload when it's dealing with hormonal changes, right? The liver it's not just about detox, it's got to process spent hormones. And so when the liver is backed up, that's a big driver in hormone balance. That's part of it. But all those things don't surprise me that were helpful.
What would be your advice for the foods that women should reach for during menopause?
Top of the list is, I'd say, eating for a balanced blood sugar. Erratic changes in blood sugar, a high glycemic diet, lots of sugar or lots of starchy foods that convert to sugar, affect insulin levels, and insulin affects all other hormones, really. And so whenever I work with women who have hormonal challenges, either PMS, issues with their cycle, or menopause or perimenopause, often when we balance blood sugar, a lot of those symptoms fade, right? So is it the hormonal imbalance, or is it the blood sugar, or are they related? So eating for a balanced blood sugar, really important. And that's kind of emphasizing protein in your diet, in the meals, healthy fats, backing off on some of the starchy carbs. Including phytoestrogen-rich foods is a big one as well. What are phytoestrogens? These are plant compounds that look like estrogen in the body. There are tens of thousands of plant chemicals in plants, and some of them look like estrogen and attach to estrogen receptors in the body. And so at the top of that list are soybeans, for example, rich in these phytoestrogens. Flaxseed, super high, top of the list. I mean, we know just 2 teaspoons of ground flaxseed a day helps reduce hot flushes. I mean, noticeably. But also things like tofu and sesame seeds and legumes in general, the bean category. Anti-inflammatory foods. Fatty fish, for example, rich in omega-3, super anti-inflammatory. Walnuts, chia seeds. You mentioned fiber, i.e. fruits and vegetables and beans. But also we can lean on things like fermented foods, sauerkraut, kimchi. Give the gut a little helping hand. Not forgetting lifestyle things. Exercise, all that stuff. Mindfulness, outside, prioritizing sleep, probably top of the list.
We know period poo is a thing for women during their cycle. What causes period poo? Why is it a thing?
Similarly to menopause, when we see hormonal fluctuations that occur during at different times of the cycle, that also affects the gastrointestinal tract. That affects the balance of beneficial bacteria, and that can affect digestion and bowel habits. We also see increases in these molecules called prostaglandins at certain times of the cycle that cause the uterus to contract, to help shed its lining. And we know that that can impact the intestines and stimulate the bowels and cause diarrhea. And so the advice is very similar.
Reach for those similar healthy foods.
Anti-inflammatory diets, fiber. And by the way, fiber is more than bran flakes. You know, we used to think fiber is just bran flake. All plants are fiber. These prebiotic foods that have the food for the gut microbes. Categories of veg like what I call the smelly veg. Onions, garlic, leek are rich in inulin, which is a prebiotic fiber. Asparagus, green bananas. Potato salad, believe it or not, is back in. When you cook potato and cool it, the carbohydrate structure changes so that it becomes resistant to absorption upstream and gets down the bowel and feeds our commensal organisms. It's like fertilizer for our gut. There are supplements as well that can be quite helpful to the whole menstrual cycle equation. Magnesium, B vitamins in combination, particularly B6, omega-3, evening primrose oil we've heard about. Yeah, that all can be helpful.
We recently launched Men's Pro Multi, which is a uniquely comprehensive formula for men's health, supporting men over the age of 45, prostate health, testosterone health, gut health, mental performance, and so forth. How does the gut microbiome differ in men to women, and why should men be investing in their gut microbiome just as much as women should be when they're at that middle age?
The gut microbiome and its impact on overall health is very similar in men and women, okay? You know, we know that virtually every organ system in the body is now linked to gut health through our studies, right? I mentioned earlier the gut-brain axis, the gut-bone axis, the gut-prostate axis is like fresh off the research bench. You know, we're all kind of like waking up to this gut-prostate axis.
So what's the data on it?
I guess it goes back to Hippocrates and how we now know that the gut is linked to so many aspects of health. And I mean, of course it makes sense, right? The gut, its primary role is to nourish every cell in the body. And so if the gut's not functioning, how can your body function well? If you're not absorbing, then you could eat the best diet in the world, but if your gut's compromised, you're not going to absorb the nutrients. Our gut also has to protect us from pathogens. So if it's leaky, for example, then it's not protecting us. Or if it doesn't have the right amount of certain beneficial bacteria, we're exposed, our immune system's compromised. And of course, it has to eliminate. It's one of its the primary detoxification route in our body is the gut, you know, the bowel. So it kind of is so logical that it makes sense to all aspects of health. And because there's so many microbes in there, I think the gut microbes absolutely link to the microbiome that we're finding in every organ of the body. We have little separate microbiomes, so there are connections there. We know that chronic gut inflammation that comes from this condition dysbiosis, for example, can contribute to prostatitis. This is the medical word for inflammation of the prostate gland. And we know that inflammation over time is a driver for cancer. So an inflamed prostate is a risk factor for prostate cancer. We also know that certain species of bacteria are associated with prostate cancer and prostatitis, like E. coli. When we find individuals with inflamed prostates, we find higher levels of E. coli in the gut. So there's a connection.
What advice would you give to men over 50 about supplements they should be thinking about to support their health?
Supplements specifically. At the top of the list for men is the mineral zinc. You know, it's involved in sperm production, in sperm motility, and in testosterone production. And most of us are running low. Zinc is an important one. Or eat oysters. Top of, highest food source of zinc by a country mile. Vitamin D helps to maintain the balance between testosterone and estrogen in men. It also benefits the prostate. B complex and magnesium, I mentioned that. L-arginine is an amino acid that promotes nitric oxide production that facilitates healthy blood flow. And blood flow is good for the brain, good for other parts of the body, if you know what I'm saying. There are also herbs like nettle root that are beneficial for prostate health and testosterone. Maca can boost testosterone. Ashwagandha, really beneficial for stress, but turns out also helpful for sperm production and testosterone production. Lycopene, powerful antioxidant and very beneficial for heart health as well as prostate health, just to name a few.
Brilliant. Mike, thanks so much for talking to us. It's been fascinating.
Great, thanks for having me. I enjoyed our conversation.